So let's talk about this idea of the Peter Pan syndrome and what it really means for the fearful avoidant attachment style. And I'm going to talk about this in a different way than we're probably used to hearing about this because the fearful avoidant attachment style doesn't exhibit exactly the traits that you might see other attachment styles when it comes to this idea of Peter Pan syndrome. So, if you're not familiar, by the way, the Peter Pan syndrome is essentially this idea that the body grows up and the mind does not, and that there are places that we really don't want to grow up, we refuse to grow up. And really, what this is from a psychological perspective is something called arrested development. And it's essentially where our mental, emotional growth is really stunted in specific areas and maybe not stunted at all in other areas. So, you could see somebody, for example, be excelling in their career and really have a lot of intelligence and awareness when it comes to their career, but maybe with just their friendships or just their romantic relationships or other very specific areas of life, they may actually be really struggling with arrested development. So what is this exactly? And why does it happen? Well, the first thing you need to know is that arrested development occurs because we have some kind of trauma. And when we go through a trauma, and again, it can be very large scale trauma or it can be really small trauma, like just something we couldn't properly emotionally process, but that happened repeatedly. And where that happens, we form this automatic coping mechanism. And where we are in automatic coping, we are not able to grow. So think about it this way, for example, the space that you are let's say you're struggling with anger, okay, as a form of arrested development, like you express anger in unhealthy ways. In that moment that you're expressing anger, when you have this knee-jerk reaction to be angry, you don't consciously think about it. There's no self-awareness, introspection. You usually just have these autopilot coping mechanisms that just come up. And you usually develop those coping mechanisms way back in childhood. And until we learn to have self awareness about our coping mechanisms, what essentially happens instead is we almost in those areas of life stay arrested in our development at the age at which we gained that coping mechanism in the first place. So if you learned as a child, for example, to have a temper tantrum, and when you had a temper tantrum, that got your needs met because maybe your parents came to soothe you or whatever it might be, then you learn this automatic coping mechanism when you feel upset or unheard or whatever it might be through a temper tantrum. And you may actually have that arrested development behavior all the way out in your adult life, where you're having these adult versions of temper tantrums in your boardroom meeting or with your partner or whatever it might be. And so that represents arrested development, where we have these automatic coping mechanisms we develop as children and we never grow through them. We don't grow up past or beyond them. And so that part of ourselves, that area of our lives that we use that coping mechanism, it's almost like it's arrested or delayed in its development. Now, when it comes to this idea of Peter Pan syndrome, sometimes we see fearful avoidance be this way. Yes, with their anger and how they express anger. Also, sometimes with commitment, with opening up, with being vulnerable, with taking big steps. A lot of fearful avoidance are really good at dating and interacting. But then when it comes to big, serious things like a big commitment, the idea of moving in together, getting married, having children, those sorts of things, fearful avoidance can be a little bit arrested in their development. They can be very fearing of those things and sort of exhibit these Peter Pan syndrome behaviors where they sabotage those things over and over again. So it's almost like they might be growing up in their career, in their friendships, in other areas of life. But when it comes to really making commitments and expanding that way, sometimes we can see fearful avoidance sabotage and try to stay in this sort of younger version of themselves sort of role. Now, this is not me saying that every person has to have kids or every person has to settle down and get married. I'm not saying that at all. But what the feature of arrested development is are you moving towards or away from those things from a place of fear or truth? If you've really self-assessed, you know what you want, it's not those things, and you're really clear that that's your truth and you're honoring that, that's not arrested development. That's you introspected, you did the work, you had the conversations with yourself, you thought about it, you reflected. But if you're just sabotaging things from a place of fear and from a place of coping mechanisms or trauma, and then Every time somebody gets close or wants to take the next steps, you push them away or you fight until the relationship blows up and doesn't work anymore. Like if you see these patterns over and over again, then that place that it's coming from in its roots of being coping oriented, that is what represents arrested development. Now, the really interesting thing with arrested development is that when you are actually using these sorts of patterns of behavior, you usually feel childlike. So you might feel this sense of like, underneath being afraid, feeling really childlike, having coping mechanisms that are childlike, difficulty controlling your emotions or outbursts, maybe having impulse control issues. And think of it like we develop these impulse control issues when we're children. Like we have, it's a very well-known thing in like behavioral stages of development that at a young age you have impulse control issues. And part of like growing and developing is to move through those things and learn how to manage your emotions and your impulses, and your impulsive behaviors, right? If you see yourself constantly having adult level temper tantrums, arrested development. Telling lies repeatedly is a form of that represents arrested development. Have you ever seen a young child and they lie about all these sort of random things and it's almost like imaginary? But if you know anybody who struggles with that in their adult lives, it can be a sign of trauma and arrested development. Having a really heightened sense of selfishness. Like think of young children. These are like early stages of behavioral development that they learn and they expand through, but we can actually get really stuck in our development in those specific areas. So how this all relates back. And by the way, if you want to do a way deeper dive into this and like work through any patterns that you might see in your life or understand them in a loved one's life, I have a webinar style course you can take it for free for 7 days using the link below. It's an hour and a half, and like you'll get all the breakthroughs you need to understand this at a deep level and shift out of these behaviors in less than 7 days. So it's an hour and a half long. You'll be able to like take the tools and use them immediately. So again, the link is down below if you want to check it out. So how this relates to this like Peter Pan syndrome idea is that there's parts of the self that because of fear go into coping, and that coping really doesn't allow us to grow up. And I always say, like, when we look at the stages of how we grow, the first requirement for growth is that we have to be able to self-observe. We have to be able to witness ourselves and notice our own patterns of behavior. And it's only through that that we can open up space to be able to then grow. The second thing is we have to look at root cause and see like what's going on down there. Like what coping mechanisms do I have and why? And then we have to take accountability and responsibility for a strategy to change it. And then we have to rinse and repeat until we actually see that change or transformation. So we have those 4 things. But think of when you're coping. Think of like when you have coping mechanisms. For some people, it's binge eating. For some people, it's, expressing anger. For some people, it's binge watching a TV show. For some people, it's using alcohol or substances or spending money or lying or having these like literally like childlike coping behaviors, right? That spending money could be like impulse control issues, right? If you were to give a child, unlimited access to money, they might just spend it all, right? They don't have the capacity to be forward thinking about those sorts of things at a young age. But we can actually get stunted in our growth at different ages around specific topics or issues that prevent us from growing up. So when we have this idea of Peter Pan syndrome, it's not just around commitment. For fearful avoidance, that is a common version of it. But it can be in all these different places for really any attachment style. And it's literally rooted that when we have this coping, when we have this way of just coping, maybe as a child, you learn to just binge watch television and that made you feel better. And now you see yourself as an adult that when you feel under stress, you just binge watch television, you just zone out, tune out. And it's like, when we look more deeply at arrested development, one of the potent things is that on the other side of arrested development, there's very powerful lessons we are not learning. So like by binge watching television, instead of dealing with my problems, right, I stunt my growth and I really don't reach my full potential or allow myself to, because I don't tackle my problems and go through them to get to the other side. Anytime we try to go around or away from something using some form of avoidance behavior, it usually just builds up in the background and festers, right? Like if it's a problem with a coworker and I just binge watch television instead of dealing with it and having the conversation to solve for it, that problem's going to stay there. It's going to get bigger over time. And that really applies to every major area of our lives. So, adult temper tantrums, right? If I just express anger in unhealthy ways and I don't learn to regulate my emotions, I sabotage relationships. I push people away with my volatility. I hurt people I love and care about, right? So like there are big downsides of these arrested development coping mechanisms, and it's very common for different insecurely attached individuals to have these or struggle with them. Telling lies, right? It affects trust in relationships. Like there's so many versions, and I'm not saying all of those versions are fearful avoidance. I was kind of just giving you many versions of this so you can see the big picture. But it's really valuable to recognize some of these things. And part of healing it is being able to go underneath and be like, what needs am I trying to get met through this arrested development coping behavior? And what is an updated strategy to come up with ways of getting this met in a healthier form? So instead of telling a lie, being vulnerable, right? And communicating something more honestly, or and working through fears of vulnerability. If I'm struggling with anger, learning to communicate boundaries assertively and healthily, learning to communicate what's upsetting me earlier on instead of waiting to the point of being angry. So it actually like always represents something we're trying to get met and cope with. But if you dig into it, there's usually huge breakthroughs waiting on the other side. So anyways, again, if you want to do a deeper dive, the actual course covers all of that. I don't want to make like a super, super long video that's overwhelming here. But you can check it out for free for 7 days, more than enough time to get through that and really to be able to understand what's going on for you if you struggle with these patterns or somebody you know does, and really be able to break through them in just an hour and a half or less by going through that course and just doing a couple simple exercises. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video and this topic. If you have more questions, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in future videos. And if you're enjoying this channel, please consider subscribing. I am here daily. I make daily videos for you, all about the subconscious mind, attachment styles, relationships, communication, you name it. So looking forward to seeing you in future videos.